Who's doing it? Good. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to House Human Services. And we are continuing our discussion and markup of H91. You all received a copy of various emails that have been sent to me. I just, so people sitting around the table and around the outside understand the process that I'm going to use is I want us to be able to get through the initial draft, get all the way through the initial draft. And then we will come back, review the revisions that we made along the way, and review the input of the various stakeholders, okay? And obviously, people have commented and people have read, so you know that it doesn't mean that you can't bring up issues as we go through the process, okay? That you might have read in one of those. But I'm trying to be a little bit, I guess, what I would call methodical about this because there are lots of individuals interested in this, and lots of people have lots of things to say. And we want to be able to take those things into consideration as much as we are able to while still sort of moving forward with a bill. And as some folks have heard, and as I told members yesterday, we have received an extension to continue working on this bill. I've been asked to complete it as soon as possible, but it doesn't have to be on Friday. So the Senate has agreed with that extension, and so people understand the importance of the work that we're doing, and they appreciate the fact that we're doing it, and recognize that this is a major transformation, and that kind of transformation takes very careful thought and attention. And while we've taken hours and hours of testimony, it's now sort of turning the experiences of all the people that we've talked to and the ideas that we've had along the way into some sort of reality in a bill. And so I just wanted people to be aware of that. Not that we're not taking the input of people around the room or the people who are listening and sending it in. We're just going to do it in a way that's a little bit more methodical, okay? The other thing that I want to make people aware of is that Representative McGuire and I need to go downstairs shortly to House General and Housing. The housing bill that we looked at the other day and we focused on VHIP. There was an addition at the very end of the bill about recovery housing. And we have some concerns about that because they're appropriating from the opioid settlement fund, which is in our committee's jurisdiction, not in the jurisdiction of the House General Committee. And they, while everybody agrees with the need for recovery housing, the proposal was considered. It did not rise to the top of proposals when the Opioid Abatement Settlement Committee submitted their recommendations, and when the commissioner submitted his recommendations, both of which, as you recall, were the same. So that is a bit of a problem. So Representative McGuire and I are going to go downstairs and speak with that committee. Yes, Representative Nielsen.
Oh, thank you very much. On Tuesday, we did a straw vote on 25-0838.
The housing bill, yeah.
I would like to change my vote.
Oh, on the straw poll?
Yeah.
You want to be up, okay.
Thank you.
All righty, thank you. I got to make note of that.
That would make it unanimous.
No, that would make it 10-1.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Representative Nielsen. So, and just for people who, are new to this process, it was a straw vote. It wasn't a quote unquote official vote of the committee. So a straw vote, people can change their minds before that's said on the House floor. In a regular, if we had taken possession of the bill and actually had a, committee vote on the bill, that would not have been possible here. So, okay, so we're off and running, when do we have Katie back?
10.
At 10, okay. So I'm going to ask that we pick up where we left off. Make sure I'm picking up the right paper. I've got a lot of papers here. All right.
Madam Chair, just
Yes.
for clarity, picking up where we left off, are we utilizing now draft 2.1 or sticking with 1.2?
We're going to stick with 1.2, and then Katie will give us a number of different drafts. We have posted 2.1.
Right.
But there will be lots more changes. And so what we'll do is we'll review all the changes when we get to the end. And we'll give Katie, I'll be giving Katie feedback about whether I think she captured the sense of what the committee was saying, along the way for each of the versions that come out. But we're going to stick right now with version 1.2. Okay. So when we last met, it seems like it was a long time ago now, but it was just yesterday. When we last met, we were talking about the different types of shelter. We were also talking about the establishment of the Vermont Homeless Emergency Assistance and Responsive Transition to Housing Program, otherwise known as VHARP. And talking about that one of the things that we need to do is be upfront in looking at number one is around prevention and retainage of housing and looking at folks at risk or people who are precariously housed. And of course, we want to have prevention be the first thing that is seen here. And so that was my recollection from where we landed yesterday. And then we were talking about, okay, does case management being a required service of all of the shelter levels, all of the shelter options. And that's kind of where we were delving into the conversation, is my recollection when we last left. And on that, Eric and I need to go downstairs. So I'll leave it in the capable hands of the two other ladies at the head of the table. And we will be back shortly. I don't think it will take too long. I don't agree to anything yet, though.
I would suggest that 2 weeks.
That's right. Okay, so to kind of continue the process of what we were doing yesterday, maybe we continue with the sections that we had not looked at and capture some comments from committee members. So by recollection, we were kind of we talked yesterday, we were talking about the organization of the sections 2202 and what kind of is under the program, what the program consists of, which kind of brings us to pages 4 and 5. So this is kind of hard because I read a lot of the comments from folks, and like we have a new draft that I haven't looked at closely yet. So now going back to the older draft and going through it I'm finding that a little challenging.
Although I just found that some some of the notes that I had on our first draft that we didn't get to yet actually are also reflected here.
Captured
So they
by
kind
that,
of,
yeah.
they kind of blend. And if I think if they've put ideas in people's head that fit into this discussion, I think that's okay. You can confuse whether it was your
Yeah.
idea or your idea
Sure.
now based on from skimming, because not everybody's had a chance probably to read through all the different things, some of which just arrived this morning.
Yeah, I think where we were talking about the ordering of things,
Mhm.
sections, and that seems to be reflected in the updated version. So I wonder if we dive into the sections, case management and the three types
Yeah, I think that's. a
at this
good
point,
idea.
because I think the structural issues, at least in the first next draft, have been taken.
Yes, the
care of.
1, 2,
Yeah.
3, 4, we
Yeah.
stick with, but we didn't get into what are the 1, 2, 3, 4, even in the section 2202. I know
Yeah,
from
so
all
I
my
think-
notes that, which we didn't get to yet,
One would
case management.
case management now would be number one. So
Right.
why don't we get into that? Which is at the middle of page 6.
Okay, so we are gonna flip around.
A little bit, yeah, because I think we talked about reordering, having
Yep.
case management be the first thing under the program.
Okay.
Which, I mean, that makes sense to me. So the notes that I made were really kind of like that this was lacking minimum standards of what case management means. So what is case management? Do we want the CAPS to offer a set of services at a minimum that everyone can expect to receive? And what should those be?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I kind of had looked at in the beginning, which, in a way they all tie together, but the distinction between the temporary emergency shelter and transitional shelter isn't all that clear. And in my mind, the transitional shelter would be much more of an expectation of really intensive services when you're, trying to meet those needs. And so case management, there might be different expectations of a core level of services in emergency shelter, which might effectively, for some people, divert them right into appropriate housing. But then you might need the transitional set for people who need kind of really enhanced. So the case management section might be a place to sort of identify that there are core things for certain groups, and then an expectation of enhanced intensity for
Different,
different
depending on
level.
where the individual is.
Right, the individual and their level of intense needs,
Right.
intensity of needs and so forth.
A good part to kind of get a preview or menu of kind of the case management services. As you remember yesterday, that link I shared.
Yes.
We were looking at the shelter, but I also pointed you to the section 1 HOP overview.
Yes.
And on those last pages, pages 12, 13, I recommend reading it all. There's some good info in there, but there's kind of a case management service definitions. So you can kind of see the different types, like broad types and what they entail. And so that might be a good place to start with the kind of, when we're thinking about what we might want to see at different levels. It's just a good starting point and reference.
So kind of in line with that, a while back, I had looked at the Family Supportive Housing Manual
yes.
and what their minimum what they expect of their service coordinators.
Yeah.
And they kind of, it's service coordination, financial empowerment coaching, life skills, student education, parent and child resiliency support, support of addiction recovery. And then it kind of goes into elements of service and what those things are. So I think we can take from those a certain number or, things that we think are a priority for that would apply to, I like your idea of saying like, depending on what the level of need is and depending on what the setting is, there should be like certain minimum required services
And
offered.
minimum is key. We don't want to say you wouldn't do more.
Right,
but
right.
You must
minimum.
at
You must
least do
these
this.
things, yeah.
Just a question or a thought in that, to me, as I read section 2206 on case management, there are some things we already set forth there as to what we would expect to include a household needs assessment, individualized household plans, et cetera. And we can go fairly deep into the weeds on this, and I'm wondering how much of that we want to do at our level versus letting the CAPS and the others who are involved in this planning stage come back to us with what they think are essential elements of case management. I'm not saying we don't lay out any framework,
Yeah.
but I'm certainly not feeling like the expert on what good case management looks like. And I can read the resources and come to a best educated opinion. But I wonder if that can be part of their planning process. Maybe setting forth again the different levels between the three types of sheltering we're envisioning. I think that's important because I've got some thoughts on that. But details leaving to others, perhaps.
Yeah, I like that. For me,
Mhm.
what's really important is like consistency, that whatever we land on, that folks that are in each setting can expect the same level of service, no matter which community action agency they went through, right? So like that, whether we identify it to like the, as detailed as, you know, maybe we're less detailed and leave it to either rules or the community action agencies, but that it's consistent
I like that.
across the board. So no matter where you are in the state, no matter which agency you're engaging with, that your expectations of that, at least the minimum core services are going to be the same.
A small aside piece to this, precariously housed is now identified in several places. And I think that, just as with unsheltered, we need to have a definition. What do we mean? Because that could be a broad or broadly interpreted.
I was going to say the same thing, that should be a part of our definition section. And I think other experts in this room know this as well, the real definition, but I have some
Thoughts on it.
yeah.
Yeah, maybe when we go back our second round and
Yeah.
look at definitions, we can.
Okay, so now should we move on to transitional shelter?
Before we
Yeah.
do that, do we want to have further discussion on any thoughts we have in the moment about the different levels of case management?
For the different
in the
settings?
different settings. I'll just, in the moment, I have a gut reaction because we have ultimately limited resources. And as I look at the extreme weather shelters option or part of this, we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. And if that's got weather triggers and we hit a warm winter, if you will, those shelters could be opened 4 times, 6 times, 8 times, 12 a year in very disparate dates throughout a 3 or 4 month period. I'm wondering about if, I guess I'm wanting us to be somewhat cautious on how much case management responsibility we put on the extreme weather shelters, when I think the intent of that is to ensure that on the worst nights of our winters, people are not outdoors. And particularly in the context of limited resource, I think there's a information sharing, referrals, things like that, that very much can be and should be part of an extreme weather shelter. But I worry about mandating too heavy a case management.
I think that's aligned with how I think the chair is also thinking
Yeah.
about it because of resources and just the inconsistency of those types of arrangements that need to be made.
I think
Right.
It's also just an opportunity to engage with somebody. So making sure that there is that initial, interaction with somebody who can at least say, hey, we have these services available.
say-
Here's an opportunity. If this is, yeah.
That's exactly what I was, there
A
needs to
warm
be
handoff rather
Yeah.
a
than.
triage, if you
yeah.
will, a triage capacity, that there be an ability to identify, you're actually someone who might be eligible for more. Can we connect you with?
Right.
Get time.
Okay, this might not make sense, but people that run the shelters, what, they just show up when it's cold weather, and then when it's not cold weather, the employees. Are the employees there all the time, I would imagine? But that doesn't,
I think the idea of it is it would just open, meaning it would just be staffed for,
hours.
safety and all that for the hours that it's open. There might be a director who's, coordinating, but I think it's intended to be mostly how a municipality would want to establish it within some minimum standards that we.
I've worked at some of these shelters, and usually the staff is full-time, they just don't float in. People can't, they have contracts, people are usually there. So what he was saying about whether temperatures going up and down, I'm pretty sure there's gonna be staff there, not just, the weather's so you gotta show up to work. So maybe we need to keep these a little more, not rely on the weather, maybe
Well, the
more,
extreme-
maybe
so
more on
we're gonna
days.
have different, so what this is envisioning is different types of shelters for different needs. So the extreme weather is meant for municipalities to stand up as they needed. So it is a separate category than like the transitional shelter. So this is envisioning different categories of shelter. So the extreme weather in this, how this is envisioning it, is that it wouldn't be a regular, always standing up, always open with fully staffed. It would be stood up when there's extreme weather and then shut down when that extreme weather goes away. So it's not going to be just to keep people, give them refuge from the extreme weather for that moment in time.
But of the type that Todd's envisioning, am I understanding correctly that in addition to players that are there, and to use my area, cots, that perhaps under the emergency temporary shelter category, by the time this is implemented, there may be a shelter where there is staff, an additional shelter in our area, in addition to cots and Spectrum, that is operating on a more regular basis.
Emergency shelter.
And that would be, yeah, that would.
Temporary shelter, and then recognizing that that may have a capacity, it may have a group of people who do not want to take advantage of that. But come -10, there are some people that may not be able to fit within the capacity of emergency temporary will go to the extreme weather shelters that are pop-up in nature, if you will. Is that?
I think that's the thought. My own thought is, if we're not doing it yet, I don't want to see that constricted to extreme weather only. In my ideal vision, which that there would be that capacity of a safe harbor roof, when you're either, there's no capacity or you don't fit the criteria, but that it would be 365 days, and not just extreme weather, that you have a place, if you wanted, an option of a safe route. Now, I recognize that may not be where we're going to go yet. Just in terms of some of the language, I was going to suggest that we have a little bit more leeway. It's almost defined that these can only be for extreme weather. And, if a municipality wants to make it broader even immediately, or to keep the concept that sort of the baseline roof not be limited to extreme shelter, even if we can only fund them or only address them in the short term for extreme weather.
Can you help me understand how you're envisioning then? To me, in the moment, that sounds like more like the emergency temporary shelter
Well, the emergency-
level of this program. So what would be the difference between the an extreme weather shelter that's not just extreme weather, but available throughout the year and the temporary.
The emergency temporary is still, is for eligible households. This is for anybody who,
Mhm.
Yes, thank you.
and because, again, because we can't do everything for everyone, the degree of services would be much more limited. Even the, case management really only plays in if you triage to that higher level that would be even emergency shelter in my mind. So
Thank you.
So, Anne, I'm hearing you say that for the extreme weather, that at the minimum, you'd like to see that us add some language that would make that more flexible, that if the municipality had the resources and wanted to stand something up full-time, full year, that this would not limit them, that they could utilize that as extreme weather, but have the option of operating it as a full year round. That would be open to anybody, any individual, and not have to meet the criteria.
right,
Eligible.
the baseline, and they have to meet that list of there's some bottom line, habitability standards, kind of thing. I don't think it would necessarily need language saying, or could be blah, blah, blah. I just think that, the emergency weather description of it needs to be, that's sort of like the minimum eligibility to get the grant, but to make it clear that it's, or could be, broader if the,
I just want to flag that I feel really uncomfortable with this section because we haven't heard from the people who would be doing this, the municipal organizations.
yeah.
I feel like we need a lot.
Well, the question-
I feel really ill-equipped to be talking about this and trying to figure this out without that input and seeing where they're at, so I just wanted to flag that.
No, I'm glad because I'm not sure municipalities.
Do they want to be doing this?
And then does it become like totally not part of the system? And that was part of,
That's my.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I feel extremely uncomfortable in this situation right now when none of the players who would actually be implementing this work are contributing feedback. And, this morning it was mentioned that we took hours and hours of testimony. We sure did put on the landscape of what's going on right now. The language of the bill was not presented. And so
Right.
they had no opportunity to look at the language and say, oh, this is doable, this isn't, we can adjust this a little bit. So process wise feels very uncomfortable and it's like you said.
Yeah, we're not making, to be clear, we're not making, this is just discussion.
Well,
We're
I know
not
it's just
making-
discussion,
yeah,
it's also an
that's-
uninformed discussion based on like our gut instincts. So I want us to have discussion when it's like really well utilized based on like input that we've gathered. And so then we can invest the time and energy into
I think,
language.
I think Todd's issue exemplifies that really well. Is like, how would a municipality have something that they staff on some days and not on others?
Exactly.
Where would you have
Yeah.
people? It's really
Especially if you're a smaller, we know Burlington does it. And, I know the person who puts it together, but they are far more just without additional state resources, well-resourced than a lot of our smaller municipalities who still have a need for this. So how do you do that in a smaller area where you may not have those extra staff who can just jump in at a moment's notice when the weather's cold? So I agree wholeheartedly that we do need a lot more testimony on the language because people were testifying on H91, which was our bill from last year, which is completely different from this. So we have received lots of testimony, but it's not really, this is a whole new ballgame. And I want to hear more from our COCs because a lot of this work and planning has been happening in the background for years. And it's been mentioned that the implementation timeframe, like that has taken years, and this will take a lot more time than we're allowing to be done right. There's growing pains in all of these, and they have a lot of. So I just I'm getting very, I don't know. It's hard for me to sit here and be having these conversations because I don't feel like we have all of the information to be making. I mean, I have been part of those processes, so I know it's my work.
Yeah.
But I feel uncomfortable with a lot of people who don't do this work every day,
Yeah.
not having the right information to be making these kinds of decisions.
In
That
fairness,
has a
yeah.
lot of impact.
In fairness to the drafter, AKA our chair,
Yes.
I mean, I think she was directly just trying to be responsive to my concern that we should have a roof over the head available to everyone. And she was trying, and it actually, it's not like I helped where this actually doesn't meet, my concept of that. It was trying to, and I think it's a big jump to say that in some fashion we achieve that. And the idea of it being via municipal grants is like a whole other concept out there. So I agree. I think maybe actually you had suggested we start with the transitional and somehow we
Ended up with.
seeped into
weather.
starting
Yeah.
with this, and it's the least refined.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Like what I was talking about, we had contracted, the city of Burlington contracted some staff that were highly professional. They dealt with some really dangerous situations that I couldn't deal with. And it's really important having the right people there during the shelter time.
Was this a shelter that was periodic and opened up during,
I
or?
did the warming shelter, the winter before, at the close down VFW on Winooski Street.
Okay, so it was just periodic when the weather was at its worst?
No, it was open from January,
Oh.
no, I'm sorry,
Okay,
December 1st to March.
gotcha. Okay.
I worked there every day. I had to scan people when they came in, but the staff it was kind of dangerous sometimes. But we figured out, we didn't let people just come in. We had to check each person. And the staff, there was a few really bad situations, staff dealt with it wonderfully. And they were very professional, and you have to have the right people in those situations.
And I'll say one of the reasons that we, as a state, it used to be that emergency shelter was triggered by the temperature at this, temperature plus precipitation versus pure
Yeah.
temperature. And the reason that was dropped in favor of a November to March, whatever, was because it was absolutely too chaotic, agencies having to sit around, oh, what's the temperature projected for tonight? Do we open or not? And that just was already deemed kind of not really viable, and yet this
Not
would
to
really.
mention
the
the impact
predictions
on the
were wrong.
individuals.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
not to, individuals had to wait to
Didn't know if
see
they
what
could,
the forecast
Yeah.
was to know whether or not they would have a roof over their head
and this
that evening.
recreates that structure, so, yeah, I think we should be jumping elsewhere for now.
Yeah, so let's move to the emergency temporary shelter section, which is 22.
What page is that?
Or page 5,
Five.
bottom of page 5.
I'm going backwards.
Notes, comments about this section.
I think that the conceptual differences there's some aspect there between emergency, temporary, and transitional, but it's really, I think there really needs to be, what are the concepts of these two types and what sort of services or whatever it is that defines them differently? Because the implication of emergency versus transitional as emergency temporary would be very time limited. But if we're not putting time limits on it, then how is it
What makes
different
them
from
different?
transitional? Which is presumably till you get into permanent. So I think it's, yeah.
And then,
One thing-
oh,
Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, I have a different issue to raise. So if you're in response to that.
Well, one thing I saw that was different in the language between emergency temporary and transitional, and I didn't know why. In the emergency temporary, need specific shelter arrangements are included, but I did not see that in transitional shelters. So again, is that an oversight? Is that an attempt to set up some sort of difference between what the shelters would do.
Well, I think we added need specific only in that, the high level, here are the three types. It's not even referenced in the 2204 language,
It
right?
is in
And I
this
think-
version.
Needs
The first
specific,
version.
In the first version?
it
Yeah,
is in the first version, but not in 2205.
yeah, line 2, page 6, needs
Page
specific
6.
shelter arrangements.
Oh, there it is. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Too.
Yeah.
Generally, we think of it kind of like a spectrum. So there's like that initial emergency. I think this may be what Teresa was getting at, because we were, our chair was talking about, is, there's that like starting point, that initial emergency triage. Then you may be in shelter. And then you kind of move into this like transitional housing, which is, a little more stable. So I think it's kind of looking at that spectrum and kind of continuum of where you need to be. So I think that's
I think that's the
what she was,
I agree.
concept she's
Yeah.
getting at. I don't know if that's,
But that, I
But
don't
it
know if
doesn't
that's
say it.
translated,
and
yeah.
it brings me to my point is, and we talked about this the other day, is the eligibility. As it stands now, we are using the eligibility for all of this
Mhm.
that we have in statute now just for the hotels, and that will be drastic. I mean, that will get rid of, we have, like I said, we funded Spectrum's youth shelter. That would no longer exist unless those youth were disabled. And we have youth shelters here in Washington County over the state, and there are other specific populations. We would see mass unsheltering if we don't, we need to spend a lot of time thinking about eligibility, because that, I just,
Tell me more about the non-eligible who are currently,
it's everyone else. I mean, we have,
but
Yeah.
are you talking about the unintentional impact of, again, I'll use COTS because that's what I'm familiar with, so that it would change what COTS and others are doing?
yeah, as it stands now, all of our shelters now would only be able to take in people who meet these eligibility requirements.
I guess I was,
That wasn't her intent.
No,
I
I-
talked with her, but that is one thing we need to
Sure.
figure out is,
I guess maybe it's in line with what Chair's intent was or not, but I was looking at these as sort of being additional to what we currently have in our shelter system.
no.
No, this is kind of reimagining the whole shelter.
The current
system.
existing and what we might create.
That's the intent of the bill, is to kind of transform the entirety of the system. But Jubilee, you bring up really good points, is that as it stands right now with the eligibility criteria in the statute, we would be excluding a whole lot of individuals from the.
Yeah, and this.
Where there are
this
specialty
top is
programs.
what
Right.
funds our current kind of shelter systems, and so what this looks to do is it's combining those general assistance funds, which is
With the
paying the hotels and things with the hops and creating this new system. So we need to think about those shelters that are already operating and the way they function, and bringing in new housing, transitional, emergency temporary shelter and transitional shelters as well to meet the need, because we know we are vastly under resourced for those as
That's my
well.
question.
And I'm curious why is there a reason that we aren't using, for example, the HUD definition of houselessness, homelessness, and I don't know, I think that would be less.
That is the
restrictive.
definition of homelessness in there.
Yeah, but I think she's saying for eligibility.
Exactly.
Like,
Oh,
we
yeah.
have the HUD definition of homelessness, but
Exactly.
then
We're
we
not
also
using that.
have
Yeah.
eligibility.
Yeah.
So
criteria.
implementing it the whole bill way through, and then also in addition to the HUD, we do, as we talked about earlier, mention precarious homelessness, and so I think that plus that could be a successful and consistent.
So the way I think about it, and I think this might be in line with how Teresa was thinking about it, which is challenging, right? Because our eligibility criteria that we currently have in statute was meant to capture the most vulnerable people, right? For the hotel and motel program. So we would have an option for housing, emergency housing for people who are most vulnerable, who are disabled, families with young kids, pregnant, we know the list. So if we do away with that and just go to the HUD definition of homelessness, the category, is it category 4, the one that, or 1? I know there's
One.
4.
That's the one.
So the 1, which is like,
Which is our,
Literal-
which is what we kept in our
Right, right,
definition.
but-
of homeless,
and
right.
do away with the categories of eligible individuals, then you, because of the limited resources, you're gonna have
Vastly too much.
really hard decisions, because then the people who, it's like first come, first serve,
Yeah.
right? And when the resources run out, the resources run out.
Is there
And
any reason
there
why?
could be a lot of vulnerable people that are not being
Highly.
served.
Yeah.
Very,
And I
very
can
much. So
redo this.
that's the,
4 categories of homelessness in HUD's definition. So there's the literally homeless, which we have the definition for. There's imminent risk of homelessness, which is kind of where their residents will be lost within 14 days of the date, and no subsequent residence has been identified. And they lack the resources or support networks needed to obtain permanent housing. There's the homeless under other federal statutes. Our COCs now mostly don't recognize that one. That would be like McKinney-Vento, that our school uses a much broader definition. And then we have category 4, which is fleeing, attempting to flee domestic violence. So I just we are using just that one
first, yeah.
here, but I think there's a lot of other really important in there as well.
Is there a reason why we couldn't bifurcate it in that we could include language that any shelter currently being run by a nonprofit or community-based organization would not have to meet eligibility requirements, so they can continue to serve the broad populations that they are, but any additional sheltering capacity created after July 1st or whatever date is intended to serve the most vulnerable and have the eligibility criteria. So we're not disrupting the good work of Spectrum, of Good Sam, COTS, et cetera, in serving a broader population.
I would be concerned about limiting the ability of future shelters to do their work, especially because, I know in my community, our organization has $1 million in the pipe for new shelters that they're running. So I don't know, changing the rules on them about who they can include versus not include might be tricky. But I do see your point as to how you want to work with limited resources. And to that point of limited resources, I think, the inclusion of low barrier daily shelters, like it's a way to include everyone and not, because they are houseless or at risk of houselessness. So versus like limits on who can come and who can't.
I keep thinking of that, funnel of triage that when we get to as we go through each of the 3 levels, the level 1 for everyone, but, just a poor roof all the way to, the really intensive and longer term services for the most highly vulnerable. And I think, it's like from what we've been doing, one category is much broader. The other category actually needs to be narrower if we're going to be able to do it. So your reference to families with young children, and I don't think of 19-year-olds or even 16-year-old as a young child. I think we all envision, the little kids. So I think the degree of resources that we can put in needs that some sort of prioritization level. And I don't know quite how you work it, but
So we've been doing that, of course, for our hotel program, LACRA program. So maybe that would be a different route to change it up less on the, for the amount of hotel blocks we have, but not to touch shelter eligibility for anyone moving forward. If we do need to make those kinds of choices, we already have a system that's not great in place, but for the hotels, but at least more case management and I guess rules apparently, that's necessary.
I think we're at the point of needing, research. I agree on this conversation to get more of a, because then the next section is
Yeah.
the eligibility, which is what
we
we're
need to
kind of
really, yeah.
crossing into, but.
Maybe go back a moment, Ann, if I could ask a question about our conversation earlier.
Yeah.
On the vision you have that gives the municipalities, if we go that route of municipalities, the opportunity to have a shelter year round.
Somebody, right.
Somebody having a shelter year round. I guess to me, it raises the question again of the limited resources ultimately that we're working with. And that the community may be able to stand that up, and I'll just make up numbers. Community says we can stand this up and they have a vision of doing something year round and we need $1 million to do it. Versus a community that says, well, we can ensure we're a pretty good sized community, but we can ensure we're open for 100,000. And the next community says we can do the winter extreme weather for 100,000. Ultimately, is the $1 million putting a pinch on the others?
No, I agree. I think that would have to come in the priorities of the funding. Because we already talked about, it needing to be, you can't do, 5 of them in Northfield and 1 in Berlin, the geographic and access issues. So there's going to be a grant making process that has to recognize those things. And I think, again, when I talked about, well, we may have to start extreme weather only. I'm not saying that you would provide all the money to do something. I just don't want to see that we consider that category to only include extreme weather. But the funding at this point clearly initially has to prioritize the extreme weather. I guess that's vaguely in my mind, but no, I agree. You can't use 2/3 of the money to give to a municipality to run a full year round. It has to be a grant criteria that prioritizes getting more essential shelter as the first phase. I don't have fleshed out how you do that, but conceptually, I think that you're absolutely right about that.
Plus, if you're talking about a full-time shelter, you have long periods of time when nobody's there.
Right.
Like, how do you reallocate those resources where they're better utilized? Just going to be hard to do if you're looking at having something that's there all year.
Yeah, I just don't want us to settle in our mind for the concept that we have an overall system that conceptualizes that only doing extreme weather for a large swath of people who have no other options means that we've done the core things to meet our intents and goals, because that certainly doesn't eliminate unsheltered homelessness.
Right.
Which is.
We could, aside from our eligibility question, and that's a big set aside, but could that not happen though through the emergency temporary shelter and an organization looking for funds through the CAPS, who would be making the grants? Could they not do it through that? If a municipality or someone else wants to stand up a new year-round shelter in a community, that seems like they do have an avenue.
But then that's a far highly more intense resource intensive, because
Or
our
expectations.
expectations around case management and so forth. It's not just the roof.
So I'm thinking that just sort of picking up on the conversation here, and then thinking about how it's structured, it would seem then, if people are leaning more towards there being a more service inclusive, I guess I would say.
In that bottom line shelter, we have not been.
You've
pushing in that
not?
direction.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought that's where you were going yesterday. like,
No, I mean, I think what we discussed, I maybe you
Go
can
ahead.
recap
Go
it better,
ahead.
but we were, I think the only service component as a minimum we talked about was having the capacity, at least the assurance of resource information being available and to have some triage capacity to recognize people who fit in an eligibility for a higher level of service. But we're still talking about the,
Okay.
that first category, in terms of everybody, roof over the head. There needs to be a link to the higher levels. What we were just talking about is I don't want to close out as part of the concept of the whole program, maybe the future ability for, and here it's like, it's not going to be, you know, the whole thing of municipalities versus somebody else, or maybe making it either can apply for a grant somehow. I don't want to close out as a concept. This only has to do with extreme weather. That, you know, if our goal is to end unsheltered, to me, this is about unsheltered people, no other required eligibility. But the concept that year round, there ought to be ideally an ability to take refuge regardless of extreme weather, that option. And that may not be something we can do now. I just don't want to see language that locks in that the concept of this core roof over the head is not part of the concept. In other words, I just
I
want
understand what you're saying.
extreme weather, you know, but not define it as limited to that as that fundamental level. Even if right now we only would be in effect financially triaging that this would be an extreme weather response.
That's my.
I think I just want to jump in again and reiterate my comment earlier. It's just like, we had wonderful testimony on H91 from Good Sam. I mean, I think brought some of us to tears. Like, the Haven in my community has a lot to say on this. Groundworks has a lot to say on this. And I just really, it makes me uncomfortable looking through the nitty gritty language, spending all this time working on that without knowing where we actually should be looking at the nitty gritty language to make changes based on the ground support. And CAPS agencies obviously should be a part of that. But I also think that the folks that we've been relying on as a government without really acknowledging that we've been relying on them so much to keep hundreds of people alive, literally, in the dead of this past winter. Like, I feel like giving them the justice that they sort of deserve to say where they want us to be putting our efforts in nitty gritty language, which is our job to do, but not, I don't think yet, not right now until that feedback has been provided. So
We had all agreed on that, and yet somehow we slipped back into some conversation on this. So thank you for reminding in terms of conveying to Teresa.
thank you. Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel a need, not because I'm thinking about any ownership of any of this, but I'm feeling a need to make sure that people understood what the intent was behind this. Was very short term, very limited, because it is congregate. I mean, and we know very clearly from all the testimony we heard from those folks and from people who receive services that congregate shelters are not the way to go. So this was really for the, I guess, prevention of loss of life in extreme weather. I mean, that's what the overall concept was, as sort of that very basic safety net. And, you know, I don't mind the concept of also if, you know, people at least knowing in that time that they're there, that they're, that they could be assessed about whether or not they meet eligibility criteria for other levels of support. So figuring out how to write that in there, but I just want to make sure we don't sort of lose the concept of sort of extreme life safety, very short term in duration. And, you know, I'm not tied to the fact that it's a municipality. I mean, you know, no, I know there's some negative reactions to that. The concept was to try to really understand that the issue of poverty affects us all. And poverty is a lot of what causes homelessness, in addition to, other things, but it certainly is at the root of it. And it's, but like I said, I'm not tied to that. This could be one component of the things that are evaluated within that local services plan, that we talked about yesterday.
And that could
And
maybe
that
be,
can be more flexible as time goes on.
right, and municipal or another nonprofit, as
yeah.
long as there's some kind of big picture where it's. But
Okay,
we also, well, anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
I think we've kind of beat this to death for now.
okay,
We had moved to talking about trying to understand the distinction between what the vision was and between the emergency temporary shelter and the transition
Okay.
shelter.
so
That's
I'm just
kind of
gonna,
where
is
we
Katie,
left
no,
off.
Katie is back. I know that you're working on something else, but I just wanted to, before I lose the concept under that, extreme weather, part, I think that we'll take it out of being a grant program operated by a statewide organization.
Mhm.
And we'll just include it as a component of the overall, VHAR.
Okay, so operated by the regional resource.
Yeah, okay. And it could be grants made to municipalities or other nonprofits. So I think the concept of municipality is still in there, but we're just gonna put it under, because I think it's probably more likely that it would be somebody other than a municipality. Okay. All right. So let's move to emergency temporary shelter and in transitional shelter. So I'm going to go to transitional shelter first because that's the easier one to describe.
Yeah.
That's worth a lot.
All right.
We tried to start there.
All right. Hi, Lily. So transitional shelter,
Should I sit here and just?
actually Katie's going to probably move to there.
Okay.
Yeah. So transitional shelter is what was intended to be what we currently know as the, community-based shelters that are out there, the Good Sam's, the Groundworks, the what was your old one there? I can't, Madison County. The John, I knew it was somebody's
Well,
name.
we have John Graham.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, which category did you say you?
The transitional shelter. I had started calling them permanent and then I realized, well, that it didn't mean that somebody was going to permanently stay there.
Right.
And so then that didn't sound right. Anyway, so that's what that's intended to be. It can be called something different if you want to call it something different. We called it community-based, but these are all intended to be community-based. So,
Right, because community-based is used for the emergency
Are you-
temporary and not referenced in the transitional.
Transitional.
Are you
Yeah.
thinking it's different from transitional housing?
yes,
Okay.
I say that with a question mark. I mean, that is, it was transitional housing, yes, I'm going to stick by the yes.
Can you?
So these transitional shelters are the entities that meet the shelter standards in
Okay.
the ones that we
Okay.
finally found yesterday on the internet, but the emergency shelter standards that DCF currently has. So that's the entities that I was
That's what you're
thinking about here.
Okay, that's helpful.
But if that's not clear, then,
That was
we should be clear.
part of our conversation while you were gone, Chair, was about the eligibility issue. And we were talking a little bit about trying to avoid the unintended consequence of imposing eligibility requirements that exist now for the motel program on these.
That wasn't intended.
Right.
Yeah.
So if we're being more intentional and discrete on who fits in that transitional category, maybe that makes it easier to have that as the exempt body from the eligibility requirements. Makes clear that they can serve anyone.
We started talking about eligibility partly in terms of places that did specially service with people who are not, like Spectrum, with people under HOP program who are not necessarily in our eligibility criteria.
Right.
We don't
So-
want to cut out.
So
Making sure.
the entities that currently operate as shelters that meet the shelter standards of the department, the eligibility criteria that were laid out were not intended to be superimposed over our existing shelter system.
Okay, so that needs to be distinguished in the
I get that.
language. Yeah,
I
okay,
get that.
okay, that's
Um,
helpful.
But would that prevent any new organization operating a program similar to Spectrum from funds under the, like, if it's like existing ones, I get that they would be kind of harmless and not, these rules wouldn't apply to them, but would a new.
I wouldn't say they'd be held harmless. I don't think that I
Well,
would.
like, they wouldn't have to adhere to those people wouldn't be excluded from the benefits.
I'm not excluding anybody. I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, just because it says eligible households, which therefore.
Based on our eligibility
Right.
It didn't
criteria.
mean-
that's
right, it
already-
It didn't mean that.
that.
and that's
Oh,
what-
okay.
That's
It
what
didn't
she's
mean that
saying.
Sorry.
eligible.
It means
Right.
top eligible,
Top eligible.
right? Rather
It
than,
means how, right now, each shelter is able to define who's eligible in that shelter. So it can be a family shelter, it can be a DV shelter, it can be a,
Okay, so not
whatever
based
shelter.
on what we have in current statute in the budget. Like,
yeah,
that's not
we
the
need to
eligibility
know.
we need to
criteria.
change
Okay.
that language because
So-
that sounds too much
I
like,
I
yeah.
understand.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm hearing that
That's
loud and
helpful.
clear many times. All set on that?
Yeah.
Okay.
We can move on.
It only intended for that particular shelter who they intend to serve.
But there,
But I do want to be clear that in the concept of developing a regional plan and assessing the needs in the region, that if we have, 4 family, I'm just exaggerating, but if we have 4 family shelters in, Grand Isle,
Mhm.
and we don't need 4 family shelters in Grand Isle, we might not fund 4 family shelters in Grand Isle. Yeah, okay, all right. I just
We used the
wanted to be.
Northfield example for 5 versus.
Oh, okay,
But
there you
we
go.
got-
All right,
We
got
got
the
the
same
same
point.
concept.
Okay. All right, so Katie, somehow we need to distinguish in this area that eligible doesn't refer to the eligibility. It's the, I don't know, Lily, is a priority population for the shelter or,
So,
this is Lily Sojourner for everybody who doesn't know, but I think she knows everybody in the room.
for the record, Lily Sojourner, Director of the Office of Economic Opportunity. I joked earlier that I'm having like a Monday morning on a Thursday morning. So if I'm following the conversation, the eligibility criteria, that's not an eligibility. I guess I have a question. Is it
Yeah.
not eligibility, but maybe like here are, right, maybe priority populations that we would want a plan to address? Or, and again, I think I came in at the tail end of like the difference between the 2 types of shelter.
Yeah,
Is one of the types of shelter connected to that eligibility list or no?
yes,
Okay. So,
not the one we're talking about right
No,
now,
the
though.
emergency temporary was.
okay, so that's helpful. So there's community-based shelters that are following
Yeah, and we should put shelter standards in here too.
definition.
HS shelter or apartment shelter standards.
And then you're kind of saying you can use, for instance, hotels as a tool, but you can only use hotels for this subset of people.
In the group that has eligibility standards.
Right, so for instance, the folks who are only 65, right, like that, okay. So-
Yeah.
And so is that the intended difference between those 2 types of shelters?
Yeah, I mean, all I was really trying to capture was that we have an existing system of shelters, community-based shelters that are out there. And that this is intended to build a continuum of shelter services from very time limited, life-saving only in bad weather, through to something that may last a little bit longer and you have a formal assessment and you have case management services, through to if you are able to access a bed and there's a vacancy, to something that is maybe longer term, that really is based upon, I mean, most of them have I don't know, I keep saying eligibility. Most of them have a population that they're serving, so I'm trying to getting rid of the use of eligible households and using for that, it's the domestic violence ones are the easiest ones to kind of identify because they have a defined group of people that they're serving. But we do have some family shelter. We do have, I'm hopeful that we'll develop more shelter for people with substance use disorder, that kind of thing. So I don't want to say, because eligible seems to bring up, all sorts of concerns for everybody. Is there another term like, and I don't want to say priority population because.
No, identified population groups.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Please let me know if I'm asking too many questions at any point this morning, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Is the intention or is your goal that you would have a subset of benefit only available to the current GA eligible population?
Yes,
Yes, okay,
yes.
So in some ways, I do think eligibility is the right word.
But we're not talking about that category right now. We're talking about the existing
Okay,
shelters.
and I think, right, and so I think it's just connecting that, and so I don't know then that you need to go beyond. I think you would have that for people who meet the AHS HUD definition of homelessness, and I don't think you need to add other.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have a problem with it saying eligible households. My issue is with section 2208 eligibility, which then says for transitional housing
Transition.
and for temporary emergency housing.
Okay, yeah.
These are the only ones that are eligible. I actually think that as Lily said, I serve eligible households, that I think that indicates that, yes, if it's a family shelter, then it serves the eligible households. My big issue is with this eligibility that is.
Okay, that's where we take it out.
Yeah, and this kind of
Yeah,
ties
that's
into
fine.
my,
That's not what I was intending.
no, the way you were just describing it, though, plays into my concern about this with the emergency shelter, criteria, eligibility based, and even the transitional based on eligibility based on the program intent. We always end up coming back to system capacity, if you will. And I just think that there's massively too big a leap between extreme weather and there being capacity for you in the system. So you can have a highest vulnerability person. We don't have capacity in these. And then unless it's, 10 below zero, you've got nothing. And I think we just have a huge gap there that if we keep the breadth of eligibility for a capacity listed system that doesn't prioritize within that group,
Well,
there's too big a gap.
well, I understand what you're saying. I also want to be really clear that I would love to say that, July 1, 2026, with the implementation of BHARP, that we were going to, through all of these mechanisms, we were going to eliminate homelessness. That's not going to happen. And I would love to say that we had $100 million to spend here. That's not going to happen.
No, and I'm not,
No, but
Right.
but I am hearing you.
Yep.
But so when we look at eligibility, Okay, so let's just look at the concepts of
Mhm.
these three levels of shelter.
Mhm.
When we look at eligibility, yes, there will be an eligibility for that medium size, but that medium space. But let's see how that plays out, because I have been thinking about that as well.
Mhm.
And I think we need to provide sufficient guidance so that community knows what to expect.
Mhm.
But I'm also in favor of understanding that one, it's not been the easiest program to implement. It's not been the easiest for people trying to receive services. Or for frankly, DCF staff to administer. I mean, all of the above are true. And so I am wide open to looking at how we deal with eligibility. There will need to be some eligibility, but how we deal with it, I'm wide open to how we deal with it. That nasty little phrase within the resources available is going to have to appear in the bill though.
So are we, for now, just for drafting purposes, in what's either 2207 or 2208 eligibility in the second line?
We're not doing that yet, Doug.
Oh, I thought you said that's where you want to take out trans.
We're not
We're not there
we're not
yet.
jumping there yet, but we will. On 2205, what we have agreed to is that one, there, is everybody okay with calling them transitional shelters? They're not meant to be a permanent place.
Yeah,
Does
I mean,
anybody have a different idea?
no, I think emergency temporary shelter has to have a different name also because there's so much in other stuff that uses that. So new system, new identification of what we mean. I think transitional shelter is not a term we've used, so that's good. And I think emergency temporary shelter maybe needs also a new name that makes this
These
clarification.
things are all going to
just-
change under a new system. All the documents that are out there on DCF land are likely to change.
I understand, but we're using the same term as is in other documents, which this will no longer apply to. So
Apply to.
using the same name, I think will be confusing.
Okay.
I think that needs to somehow be renamed.
Okay, so under transition, I'm just going to
Yeah.
summarize here. Under
Yep.
transitional shelter, a regional resource organization shall serve or cause to be served, Katie.
Okay.
Eligible households, leave in eligible households in its service area in need of the services of a transitional shelter in the manner it deems best to meet the needs of the service area, period. And then we need a new sentence in there that they need to comply with department shelter standards. I don't list them as HOP shelter standards anymore, just list them as department shelter standards. A regional resource organization may provide or cause to be provided transitional shelter through master grant leases, developing shelter capacity, other arrangements, combinations that comply with the intent of the chapter. People okay with that, like right now,
Fine
to
for
be able to
working.
move out for
For
working?
working, yes.
Okay,
For working.
now,
Go back to it.
let us go back to 04. Okay, so this is meant to be the component that encompasses a more flexible approach to what people have historically called the motel program. So it doesn't limit it to hotels. And it doesn't, say that they can't use hotels, or it doesn't say that, and it's actually, I really do hope that part of this, I'm sending this out there to the land who's listening, that there will be some sort of master lease, being able to work out local arrangements where a block of 30 rooms is leased by whatever entity, and they have agreements about what that lease means. That's very difficult to do in state government. Very difficult. Just putting that out there. It is, I'm not going to say it's easy, but it is more easily achieved in through the use of local resources that we are setting up here. So, and again, I'm just trying to be cautious that what we're doing here is trying to set out the outline for what we expect, not all the details to be filled in. But if there are things that we don't want people to guess about, Those are things that we should include. Go ahead, Esme.
One question here is about regional resource organization and who will be allowed to be the caseworkers that work in the motels. So would you mind clarifying for me once more just what the RRO would mean in this situation? Like, could it be, for example, like staff at like the Haven, for example? I know they do interact, like there are caseworkers from the Haven that go into the motels. Would they still be able to do that under this?
What the expectation is that the regional resource organization works with the community partners, including shelter providers, including hotel owners, if they want to bring them in, including people who have lived experience, including their members of their board, that they develop a plan for what's needed and who should be providing what's needed. Haven says, I'll take on
The case
the
management.
case management for X. People, so they can submit a proposal to do that. The other thing I think is not lost in this is that what I hope is going to be something that is, I guess I would say, a bit more organized than what exists now. So if I know I have a client over here and I just have that client there, it'd be lovely if we could say, the Haven has this emergency temporary shelter and they have the staff to do that. Or, somebody else has this emergency shelter in Rutland and they're the folks who are staffing the case management services there. But that's not going to be up to us sitting here. That's going to be up to the regions to decide. So yeah, I mean, they would be able to do it. They'll have a voice at the table of making the decision. But it'll be part of what they decide is best of that region.
Thank you.
We
Yeah.
also had talked about, when we talked about the number one, which was case management, that these should probably have some cross-reference to the intensity of case management services expected, the at least these case management for these levels of shelter.
So there might be different levels of case management.
There might be
depending on where
more
Depending on
intensive
where you are.
expected.
Depending
yeah.
on the setting.
Yeah.
Because case management, we were recognizing that has to also be something that would be developed in the planning.
Yes.
But we do need to set some expectations and the minimum expectations may differ between currently named emergency and transitional.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we need to, we agree we needed to flesh out case management more in terms of what those minimum expectations
Okay.
would be.
Okay. So for what is currently called emergency temporary shelter. And again, Katie, a regional resource shall serve or cause to be served. Eligible households in its service area and I'm thinking we put eligibility maybe as a subcategory in here so that people
Had the same.
very good. People understand that it only goes with this category.
So, yeah, maybe it's a sentence at the end of each of those two saying, case management services must be a component of this category at a certain level.
Yeah.
And likewise for transition.
So we'll need a sort of a placeholder for how to
Yep.
define that, Katie, but in
Sorry, I missed that. It was
yeah,
right.
that's okay. Case management services, there is an expectation for case management services and but as we've been talking that the degree and intensity of those services might differ depending upon the levels.
Do you want to put that in the case management section or do you want to in each level of shelter?
I think they have to kind of be cross-referenced, not with as extensive language, but I would say the emergency and the transitional kind of need a sentence saying minimum levels of case management shall be included, and then spell it out
In the
what
case
those
management
categories
section.
would be in the case management, because there'll be a different for precariously housed, for instance. Some of case management goes to services for people that are not in these shelters.
Correct.
So that needs to spell out all of those levels with a little bit more of expectations. But I think there just should be a brief reference in
Okay.
04 and 05 to have to meet minimum case management standards as identified in 2206, maybe, something like that.
Okay. And so we moved 2206 up to be first though, right?
Yes, we're
Yeah.
just using these as the old numbers. I am anyway,
Yeah, me too.
because we're not looking at the new draft.
Okay, so, do we want to talk about what those levels might be and what that, or do you want to move to eligibility? I'm open to
Let's talk
whichever you
about
want
case
to do.
management.
Let's
because
talk a
we
little
talked
more.
a little bit about it while you were gone.
Okay.
So I think,
All right,
so we were
summarize.
talking about using the current DCF standards and the elements that Jubilee shared that we found yesterday. And then I mentioned the family supportive housing elements of case management. So again, noting that for each setting, there will be different minimum requirements for case management, but using some of the existing standards that DCF already uses to create the different levels for each setting. And we talked about like at the extreme weather, it would be more of a handoff resource, giving folks resources and identifying maybe what services they may be eligible for and informing them of that, which would be a lot more limited.
Mhm.
And then kind of step up from that to the different levels.
I raised the question in the conversation about what level of detail we may want to get into, or whether we want to rely upon the RROs reporting back to us. If we set a floor, give them time during this transitional year to perhaps lay out for us how they envision case management than rather than being too prescriptive.
Yeah, I think that that's a good idea, and it's not in here yet, I don't think, but the reporting back probably, I would say by February 1st with an implementation plan, is there an update on the progress or something like that? We don't.
Progress report.
Progress report, yeah. So we'll want to insert some.
2.1.
It's okay.
I did also note that we.
I knew we talked about it at some point, but I don't
We
remember.
did envision having consistent, so whatever it is, so we may not get too specific in the language, but we want, the expectation is that no matter which part of the state and it ended up, they would have similar services, that there would be minimum standards
Yes.
for each of the settings.
Yes. And I'm just wondering if we should be specific about who potential service providers could be around case management.
I wouldn't think we'd want to do that yet. That would be part of the come back to
The
us
implementation.
as to who might do them, because that ultimately becomes the RRO, that process of local planning,
part of the-
who does what.
And so I'm not sure exactly where to put this, but in my head, what I was thinking about was I want to make sure that the concept of peer supported services get in there as an element of service provision, and case management is where I was thinking about that, but
That would be the place to include as one of the elements that, as our baseline, that they then bring back in
yeah,
their
so
further.
instead of organizations, just say, an element would be peer supported case management supported by peers or whatever. Okay,
And I think this is addressing, Esme, to some degree, the desire to have the voices heard that we are challenged to hear in the timeline that we're working with this legislative
And I think-
session.
Right, and they're in maybe they need to be more than, but I mean, they're in that planning group actively, I think. They're in the advisory committee that may not be the same as the implementation planning, but
Yeah.
yeah, we need to make sure they are active in each of those phases of coming back.
Okay, so I'm trying to summarize for Katie. I'm not exactly sure what we've done in case management. So maybe we need a statement here, Katie, that identifies different levels of case management depending upon the shelter level being accessed or something like that.
Okay,
Um,
and then some type of reference to there being case management supported by peers.
yeah,
And then in the
Or the-
implementation plan, you want language like specifying what some of the service providers and services might look like.
well, sorry.
Minimums.
Yeah,
Yeah.
what I'm coming back to is I want to address the fact that, you know, there's a lot of anxious people out there, understandably, it's like, they are familiar with what the current system is and they're wondering what the new system will be like. And I get that. I understand that. And we don't want to unduly have, too much anxiety out there. I mean, people who are providing case management services and doing a good job at providing case management services, people are going to want to continue to have them do
Mhm.
that. I don't know how to convey that, I
So-
guess.
So I'm just trying to list them here from the different input. And if we say, the plan needs to come back to us or whatever, that we want a minimum standards based on the type of
Okay.
shelter that would be the same across, those minimum standards, the same across all
Regions, yeah.
regions. Using key elements from the current DCF standards, and then that include, and we may, that's where we put the baselines that they flesh out, and the includes would include peer supports. And maybe some of the things that were listed in the
In the case
includes
management.
here.
Hey, I would just
Yeah.
add peer supports in this list.
In
I
this
think.
list, that's the
Yeah.
includes list.
Yeah,
But we may want to, this includes list that's already there. There may be some other elements that people want to make sure are
yeah,
included that,
I'm sure there will be as we
yeah,
get the feedback that we receive.
yeah.
Sorry, I'm lost on the case management supported by peers. So I have in the implementation plan, what are the minimum services based on shelter level across, you want the same standards across the regions of the state using key elements from existing DCF standards. Nothing there about peer support.
No,
We're just adding peer supports to the list of,
To the case
That's
management
correct,
section.
That-
Got it, good.
that's- yeah.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
including, yeah.
Lily has.
yeah, go ahead, Lily.
Thank you so much. Just a question for consideration, are you? And I know you're kind of reorganizing, are you then gonna break down like eligibility case management by the two different types of shelter activities and then have just a standalone case management section? Because I just wanted to raise that case management is also eligible currently for people who are not in shelter. And so wanted to kind of clarify and
Yes, it's going to be.
raise that.
Yeah, we have it listed. So the way this is going, when we, in the version that's out there now that I haven't read yet, but after we talked about this yesterday, VHART, the first thing that we're listing is the preventative services. Okay, so that we, part of what got lost in my head was, because I've been so focused on shelter, was the preventative nature of some of the services in HOP now. And so, yes, those would be there. And yes, those would be available to people who aren't in shelters. Yes.
So maybe,
Including case management.
so maybe that outline that I just referenced would say, when it says as applied to the level of shelter, it would include
Precariously.
or
Yeah.
the, right,
Yeah.
the level. Because we kind of want, what are those minimum standards for that group, for the precariously housed, which we agreed needs a definition in the,
Okay.
when we go back to
And those-
definitions.
Sorry to interrupt, but those who are experiencing homelessness who are not in.
In shelter.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you have those.
Yes, they're included.
Right,
Yeah. And, currently also in the definition the AHS HUD definition of homelessness includes a, for instance, an imminently homeless category. So like, I'm not sure, for instance, how some of these definitions align or not, and if folks who would be eligible for services now.
Yeah, I mean, that might be,
with the language that you're using, and, you know, again, I need to review that AHS HUD language and see very explicitly, like, what would you want to include or not.
Yeah.
Um,
yeah, I mean, I would envision those people being in the precariously housed.
As the part of the definition.
um,
Do you have a different definition for precariously housed?
well, so currently, we have an at-risk of homelessness definition, which would align with precariously housed, and then those who are at imminent risk often are eligible for the same benefits as people experiencing homelessness, because there's like a date, you know, and so to allow for some of that planning to say like, oh, you could access this resource. So I think that's just important for the committee to consider and then provide clarity, so community
Yeah.
members would be able to understand, for instance, where folks in that imminent.
I don't think that our intention is not to be exclusive, you know, of people who are currently receiving support. I think our intention is to, I do want to try to simplify things if we are able to simplify things. So sometimes fewer categories is helpful when we're trying to simplify things. Not always, but sometimes. So, but I do want to, acknowledge that if there are things that we are missing or things that seem to be left out, that, you know, we're continually getting feedback as we move through this process, which is all good. I appreciate it from everyone who is here and those who are listening. So thank you. All right. Did you guys take a break? Okay, this seems like a good